Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we look at the U.S. deployment of B-52 bombers near Venezuela and the public confirmation of covert CIA operations. We also examine Bolivia's upcoming presidential runoff, which has deepened divisions between left and right-wing factions. In Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we look at widespread strikes and protests in Belgium as the new government pushes forward with austerity measures, and at Washington's consideration of providing Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. We also cover Hamas's consolidation of control in Gaza, reports that Houthi forces have been ordered to halt attacks in the Red Sea, and the growing risk of unrest surrounding elections in Ivory Coast and Cameroon. In Madagascar, we assess the fallout from the recent military coup and the president's impeachment. And in Asia-Pacific, we look at rising tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan, where deadly border clashes have followed Pakistani airstrikes in Kabul. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where the U.S. has deployed B-52 bombers near Venezuela and confirmed covert CIA operations. On October 14, 2025, the U.S. military conducted another strike on a vessel off Venezuela's coast, killing 6 people. The attack took place in international waters, with U.S. authorities stating that the target was linked to narco-terrorist networks. The following day, on October 15th, U.S. Air Force B-52 Stratofortress strategic bombers were sighted flying within the Maiquetía flight information region, north of Los Roques, Venezuela. The aircraft operated close to the Venezuelan islands of La Orchila and Gran Roque, both of which host military facilities. Later that day, the Trump administration publicly confirmed that it had authorized covert CIA operations in Venezuela aimed at targeting the Maduro regime's infrastructure and networks, presenting them as part of a broader anti-narcotics campaign. President Donald Trump also suggested that U.S. efforts could soon expand to target Venezuelan drug cartels on land, claiming that maritime trafficking had been almost completely stopped, and that the next step would be to curb cross-border operations by land. Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro denounced the U.S. actions as destabilizing and accused Washington of attempting to orchestrate regime change. In response, Venezuela has mobilized military forces and civilian militias and has forward-deployed air defense units. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The B-52 is a long-range strategic bomber with one of the largest payload capacities of any operational combat aircraft. It is capable of carrying a wide array of weapons, including precision-guided bombs, cruise missiles, maritime strike systems, and nuclear ordnance. Deployments of B-52s are generally linked to interstate tensions or acts of strategic deterrence. In this instance, the aircraft's flight path was broadly consistent with previous training exercises conducted in the Caribbean. While the bombers did enter Venezuela's flight information region, they did not cross into or violate Venezuelan sovereign airspace. Moreover, the B-52s operated with their transponders active and transited through controlled airspace. The presence of these bombers, when viewed alongside current U.S. naval deployments and the recent confirmation of CIA operations, has likely been carefully calibrated to send a strategic message to Caracas, signaling pressure to curb narcotics trafficking and to deter further escalation, rather than to prepare for direct military engagement. The United States is also likely using these actions to send a broader signal to Venezuela's allies, including China, Russia, and Iran, that Latin America remains firmly within Washington's sphere of influence. However, if no constructive response is observed from Caracas, there is a realistic possibility that Washington could escalate its operations to include strikes on vessels inside Venezuelan territorial waters, or even drone strikes on land-based targets. Such moves would markedly increase the risk of escalation and miscalculation, particularly given Venezuela's possession of several Russian-designed air defense systems capable of targeting and engaging aerial threats, including U.S. drones. U.S. force projection in the Caribbean, coupled with the public confirmation of CIA operations, has almost certainly intensified pressure on the Maduro regime. The CIA's historical role in coups across Latin America, including in Guatemala, Chile, and Nicaragua, lends added weight to perceptions in Caracas that regime change efforts may be underway. These concerns have been further amplified by the recent awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, a development that has likely energized the opposition and unsettled the government. In response, the Maduro regime is highly likely to tighten its grip on power through increased security crackdowns, arbitrary detentions, expanded censorship, and heightened military readiness, while continuing to portray U.S. actions as unlawful and a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. Still in the region, Bolivia's presidential runoff between two right-wing candidates is heightening political polarization and fueling unrest. On October 19th, Bolivians will return to the polls for the second round of the presidential election. The contenders, Rodrigo Paz Pereira of the Christian Democratic Party, PDC, and former President Jorge Quiroga of the pro-business Libre Group, secured the highest vote shares in the first round on August 17th. Both leaders are aligned with the political right, and their parties also performed strongly in the August parliamentary elections. The right's resurgence coincides with the collapse of the left-wing movement towards socialism, or MAS, which governed Bolivia for 2 decades but has now virtually disappeared from parliament. MAS's poor showing reflected deep internal divisions between factions loyal to former President Evo Morales and those backing incumbent Luis Arce. The resulting split in the party's base led to widespread voter abstention and null ballots, which reportedly accounted for 19% of all votes cast. Evo Morales, who has been barred from running and faces multiple criminal charges, remains in his stronghold of Cochabamba, where he continues to wield considerable influence. Pro-Morales demonstrators, viewing his exclusion from the election as anti-democratic, have repeatedly set up roadblocks, organized protests, and clashed with police in the run-up to the first round of voting. These confrontations have resulted in several deaths, numerous injuries and arrests, and widespread disruption across Bolivia. Now our assessment. There is a realistic possibility that the second round of Bolivia's presidential election will spark significant unrest. This risk stems from deepening political polarization between supporters of the two remaining right-wing parties, the PDC and Libre, combined with the disparity between the left's enduring popular backing and MAS's poor electoral showing. The ongoing controversy surrounding Evo Morales' exclusion from the race further heightens tensions and increases the likelihood of renewed protests and clashes. Both the PDC and Libre have increasingly adopted inflammatory rhetoric in attacking one another. Pereira's running mate, Edmund Lara, who has a large social media following and is, in many respects, as popular as Pereira himself, has claimed that if Quiroga were to win the runoff, it could only be the result of fraud, and has vowed to call for protests in that event. In response, Bolivia's Supreme Electoral Tribunal has urged both candidates to sign an agreement committing to a peaceful vote. The escalating tension has also fueled hostility toward democratic institutions. Juan Pablo Velasco, Quiroga's running mate, recently accused the media of waging a dirty war against the campaign after the resurfacing of old tweets, allegedly from his account, containing racist language. Civil society groups have noted that the 2025 electoral campaign has coincided with a marked rise in attacks on journalists, reflecting a pattern similar to that seen during the 2019 election. The absence of a credible left-wing alternative after 2 decades of MAS dominance is likely to fuel widespread dissatisfaction with the election outcome. Left-wing ideologies remain deeply entrenched and popular across Bolivia, particularly among rural, indigenous and working-class communities in regions such as Cochabamba and the Western Highlands. MAS's long-standing focus on social welfare, state control over natural resources, and indigenous political representation almost certainly continues to resonate with a large segment of the population. The party's poor performance in the general elections should therefore not be viewed as a rejection of left-wing principles, but rather as a consequence of internal divisions and high levels of voter abstention. Controversial policies promoted by both Quiroga and Pereira are likely to be met with strong opposition in rural, indigenous, and working-class communities. Among these are proposals to repeal several welfare programs introduced under MAS, as well as plans to reorient Bolivia's foreign policy away from long-standing allies such as Cuba and Venezuela, and toward closer alignment with the United States. This shift comes at a time when U.S. foreign policy is increasingly focused on its near abroad, including a nascent campaign against Mexican and Venezuelan cartels and discussions around the possible return of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration to Bolivia, an agency expelled by Evo Morales in 2008. For many MAS supporters, such developments are likely to reinforce perceptions of U.S. involvement in Latin America as interventionist, imperialist, and destabilizing. These policy shifts are likely to heighten anti-government sentiment and serve as major drivers of future unrest. Even if large-scale protests do not erupt immediately after the presidential vote, Bolivia's rightward turn is likely to spark widespread demonstrations, roadblocks, and labor strikes over the longer term. These will be driven by fears of foreign interference, economic exclusion, and the dismantling of long-standing social protections, including the reduction of fuel subsidies that have been in place for more than 2 decades. Protests linked to MAS and its supporters have become increasingly violent and disruptive, frequently involving roadblocks, arson attacks, and clashes with security forces. If these tactics become entrenched as a central form of opposition, they are likely to cause significant transport disruption, supply shortages, and broader economic losses. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where Belgium has been hit by widespread protests and strikes over austerity measures introduced by the new government. On October 14th, Belgian labour unions launched a general strike against the austerity policies proposed by the recently appointed government. The right-wing coalition, led by Flemish nationalist Bart de Wever of the New Flemish Alliance, has introduced a series of sweeping reforms aimed at reducing Belgium's budget deficit, which currently exceeds the European Union's fiscal limits. The measures include reductions in unemployment benefits, stricter regulations on public sector employment, cuts to pensions, and an increase in the state pension age from 65 to 67. Demonstrations were held across the country, causing major disruptions in Brussels, Antwerp, Liège, Ghent, and Charleroi. In Brussels, organisers claimed that more than 150,000 people took part in the protest, while police put the figure closer to 80,000. Violence broke out in the city centre, where demonstrators vandalised a government building and a luxury hotel near the central train station. Police responded by deploying tear gas and water cannon to disperse the crowds and made dozens of arrests. The protests caused severe traffic disruption across the capital, with several major roads blocked. Operations at both Brussels and Charleroi airports were brought almost to a standstill as baggage handlers, security staff, and other airport employees joined the nationwide strike. Major disruptions were also reported at several of Belgium's key ports, further amplifying the strike's impact on transport and logistics. Now, our team's assessment. Fiscal rules introduced by the European Union in 2024 under the Reformed Stability and Growth Pact require member states with public debt exceeding 60% of GDP to reduce it by at least 1 percentage point per year on average. Countries with high debt levels must also submit 4-year fiscal plans outlining their budgetary targets, reform measures, and investment strategies. With Belgium's debt-to-GDP ratio currently estimated at over 106%, the fourth highest in the EU, the country has been subject to an excessive deficit procedure since July 2024, initiated by the European Council. As a result, the Belgian government is operating under enhanced EU fiscal surveillance and must demonstrate a credible plan to reduce both its deficit and overall debt in line with EU requirements. The De Wever coalition campaigned on a platform of fiscal discipline and economic liberalisation. In combination with the EU's strict fiscal requirements, the government will almost certainly be compelled to implement a broad package of austerity measures aimed at accelerating Belgium's debt reduction. These measures are likely to include cuts to social welfare spending, pension reforms, reductions in unemployment benefits, and significant downsizing of the public sector. As demonstrated by the recent nationwide strikes and protests, such policies are expected to face strong public opposition and further industrial action. Several unions have already suggested organizing regular nationwide demonstrations on the 13th of every month, signaling the potential for a sustained protest movement. As the new government moves forward with its austerity agenda, further waves of strikes, protests, and disruption are highly likely across Belgium. Unrest is expected to be most intense in Brussels and the French-speaking Wallonia region, home to major industrial centres. These areas have a long tradition of left-wing politics and strong trade union influence, making them particularly prone to mobilisation against austerity measures. The situation is further complicated by the composition of the new government, which is not only right-wing but also Flemish nationalist, a factor likely to deepen Belgium's long-standing linguistic and regional divides. Now moving to Ukraine, where Washington is weighing the potential supply of Tomahawk missiles, while Russia moves to expand its reserve deployment amid a shifting battlefield. US President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky are scheduled to meet at the White House on October 17th, following the arrival of senior Ukrainian officials in Washington earlier in the week. The meeting comes after a phone call between the two leaders on October 12th, during which Trump reportedly said he might issue Russian President Vladimir Putin a new ultimatum to resume serious peace talks or face the US supplying Ukraine with long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles. On October 12th, Russian President Vladimir Putin warned that the provision of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine would mark completely new, qualitatively new stage of escalation. The following day, President Trump stated that he had sort of made a decision regarding the possible transfer. Zelensky's upcoming visit to the White House is expected to focus primarily on discussions surrounding potential new arms deliveries, most notably the Tomahawk cruise missile system, but also the possible supply of additional Patriot air defense batteries. On October 13th, a draft amendment backed by Russia's Ministry of Defense was approved, allowing for the deployment of active reserves abroad without the legal requirement for Russia to be formally at war. Once officially enacted, this measure would permit Moscow to deploy its estimated 2 million active reservists to Ukraine, a move it has so far been unable to make under existing legislation, as Russia has never formally declared war on Ukraine. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Ukraine's long-range strike campaign against Russian energy infrastructure has achieved significant results. On October 14th, the International Energy Agency revised its projections for the impact of these strikes, stating that Russia's refinery processing rates are likely to remain suppressed until at least mid-2026. According to the IEA, Russian fuel exports in September fell to their lowest monthly level in a decade, excluding April 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic. Russia's main advantage on the battlefield continues to be its vast pool of manpower, which allows it to sustain prolonged offensive operations, absorb heavy casualties, and maintain greater operational endurance and flexibility than Ukraine. The Kremlin has so far managed to meet its extensive manpower requirements without launching a full-scale mobilization or widespread conscription, relying instead on substantial financial incentives to attract volunteer recruits. Moscow's large mobilization campaign in 2022 triggered protests and a mass exodus of men seeking to evade military service, an outcome the Kremlin is almost certainly determined to avoid repeating. While public support for the war against Ukraine remains broadly high within Russia, a renewed push for mass mobilization would likely erode that support and risk sparking renewed domestic unrest. Russia's war effort remains heavily reliant on hydrocarbon revenues. However, Ukraine's long-range strike campaign against Russian oil and gas infrastructure, combined with ongoing international sanctions, has almost certainly reduced these revenues and constrained Moscow's ability to fund financial incentives for new recruits. The proposed amendment to reservist deployment laws will allow the Kremlin to sidestep the politically sensitive process of mass mobilization by enabling the deployment of trained reservists who have already signed voluntary contracts with the Ministry of Defense without issuing an official mobilization decree. Russia claims to have around 2 million active reservists, compared with an estimated 880,000 active personnel in Ukraine's armed forces. Nonetheless, given that these reservists are trained soldiers and that tensions with NATO remain high, Moscow is unlikely to commit a significant portion of its strategic reserve to the front. The legislative change is likely intended, at least in part, to signal to Western governments that Russia possesses both the manpower and the determination to sustain the war over the long term. The provision of Tomahawk missiles is unlikely to dramatically change the strategic impact of Ukraine's long-range campaign. Estimates vary, but the US is broadly expected to supply only a limited number of Tomahawks if it proceeds. That said, Tomahawk offers capabilities beyond Ukraine's current long-range threat, which is dominated by attack drones and, to a lesser extent, relatively crude domestically produced systems such as Flamingo. Those advantages could enable Kyiv to strike strategic targets that require larger explosive payloads and deeper penetration of Russian air defenses. The use of Tomahawk missiles by President Trump as leverage over the Kremlin is also significant. He has hinted at issuing a new ultimatum to compel Moscow to engage seriously in negotiations, using the possible transfer of Tomahawks to Ukraine as a coercive threat. The credibility of Trump's ultimatums has likely increased following his claim on October 15th that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi agreed to halt purchases of Russian oil under the threat of tariffs. In addition, the Trump administration has threatened to impose tariffs of up to 500% on China, specifically to deter Beijing from continuing to buy Russian oil. The Kremlin's messaging has almost certainly aimed to deter the provision of Tomahawk missiles by emphasizing the risks of escalation. Russian officials and state media figures have repeatedly highlighted that certain Tomahawk variants are capable of carrying nuclear warheads, framing their potential delivery as a major provocation. According to a senior Western military official, the missiles could be transferred rapidly, with US contractors potentially deployed to assist Ukrainian forces. This arrangement would remove the need for extensive training while allowing the Pentagon to retain control over targeting and sensitive technologies. Such a deployment would almost certainly be viewed by the Kremlin as an escalation, likely prompting an intensified campaign of hybrid operations, including cyber attacks, disinformation efforts, and covert destabilization activities. There is also a realistic possibility that Moscow would adjust its targeting patterns in Ukraine to focus more directly on assets linked to the United States and its European allies using long-range strikes. Turning to the Middle East, where in Gaza, Hamas operatives are conducting arrests and executions to reassert control over areas vacated by Israeli forces. Since the withdrawal of the Israel Defense Forces from large parts of the Gaza Strip under the ongoing ceasefire agreement, Hamas has conducted a series of arrests and public executions in territories it has recently re-entered, Footage of these executions has been widely circulated online by pro-Hamas accounts and affiliated users. Several of the executions have targeted clans and groups that previously challenged Hamas's authority in parts of Gaza. Between October 10th and 13th, Hamas operatives reportedly executed at least 32 members of an unspecified criminal gang. On October 12th, local media reported that Hamas forces attacked suspected members of the Dogmush clan in Gaza City, killing 19 people. Now, our assessment. The recent executions and raids almost certainly reflect Hamas's efforts to reassert itself as the sole governing and security authority within the Gaza Strip, filling the power vacuum left by the withdrawal of Israeli forces. Throughout the conflict that followed the October 7th, 2023 attacks, Hamas consistently prioritized degrading rival clans and armed groups that challenged its control. In March 2024, its fighters killed several key leaders of the Dogmush clan, even amid ongoing Israeli airstrikes and ground operations in Gaza. Just days before the ceasefire, on October 3rd, Hamas forces launched an assault on the Mujahideen clan in Khan Yunis. Hamas is highly likely to continue conducting high-intensity operations against perceived rival factions in the short term. Although these actions risk provoking public backlash within Gaza and international condemnation, particularly as civilian casualties among unaffiliated individuals are likely, Hamas leadership almost certainly views the suppression of potential rival power centers as essential to its survival. In their assessment, the long-term threat posed by internal challenges outweighs the short-term political costs of maintaining control through continued violence. The recent attacks, which likely reflect Hamas's efforts to consolidate power within the Gaza Strip, are also likely to undermine prospects for a lasting peace. Although several key mediators of the Israel-Hamas ceasefire, including the United States, have so far avoided directly condemning the killings, the incidents strongly suggest that Hamas intends to remain both armed and in control of Gaza. These are two positions that remain clear, non-negotiable red lines for both Tel Aviv and Washington. Meanwhile, in Yemen, the Houthis have reportedly been ordered to halt attacks against Israel and shipping in the Red Sea. Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the leader of Yemen's Houthi movement, has reportedly ordered his forces to suspend attacks against Israel and Israeli-linked vessels in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. The directive follows the implementation of the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, with Houthi leaders stating that their campaign of attacks had been carried out in support of Palestine. The suspension is conditional on Israel maintaining its adherence to the ceasefire. Now our team's assessment. Following the January 2025 Gaza ceasefire, the Houthis announced that they would halt their maritime campaign against all but Israeli-flagged vessels and ships wholly owned by Israeli individuals or entities. The latest reports therefore suggest that the Houthis have now suspended their campaign entirely. However, these reports are based on unnamed and unverified sources briefing Saudi media rather than on official Houthi statements. Moreover, any suspension of attacks is likely to remain conditional on the stability of the Gaza ceasefire, which is still fragile, with both Hamas and the Israel Defense Forces reportedly having breached elements of the agreement. The Houthis will almost certainly use any pause in Israeli airstrikes on Yemen and in their own maritime campaign to rebuild stockpiles and restore their operational capabilities. Their recent campaigns have elevated the group's status from a local insurgency to a powerful regional actor with global influence. At the same time, emerging reports suggest that the Houthis and Iran have shifted their weapons smuggling routes towards Sudan's Red Sea coastline. If confirmed, this would indicate that the Houthis are exploiting Sudan's instability to facilitate the transfer of advanced weapon systems, including long-range attack drones, from Iran, their principal patron. Sources indicate that Iranian advisors have been active in Sudan since late 2023, and that Houthi personnel may also be operating within the country. An increased Houthi presence in Sudanese territorial waters would likely raise the threat level to Red Sea shipping if attacks were to resume, and could help explain the growing lethality of individual Houthi strikes against merchant vessels in 2025. Throughout their campaign, which began in November 2023, the Houthis have likely struggled with limited intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, as evidenced by the inaccuracy of many attacks and the frequent misidentification of vessels. Using Sudanese waters or even the Sudanese coastline as a base for ISR operations, for example, deploying skiffs equipped with reconnaissance drones or establishing shoreside surveillance systems, would likely enhance the Houthis' ability to locate, track, and target vessels transiting sections of the Red Sea that currently lie beyond the effective range of their ISR assets based in Yemen. In Ivory Coast, political tensions are rising ahead of the presidential election, with opposition groups alleging bias in the electoral process and warning of potential unrest. On October 11th, at least 237 people were arrested during demonstrations against what protesters described as growing government authoritarianism ahead of the October 25th vote. The prefect of Abidjan had declared all marches in the capital illegal in the pre-election period, citing the need to maintain public order. Security forces responded to the protests with tear gas and makeshift roadblocks. Following the unrest, Ivory Coast's two main opposition parties called for daily demonstrations beginning on October 12th. Among those urging supporters to take to the streets were former President Laurent Gbagbo and Tidjane Thiam. Thiam, leader of the Democratic Party of Côte d'Ivoire, had been the main challenger to incumbent President Alassane Ouattara, but was removed from the electoral register on legal grounds, as he held dual French-Ivorian nationality at the time of his registration. Now our assessment. Increasing state repression has marked the run-up to the election, prompting growing concern among observers about Ivory Coast's democratic stability. In August 2025, 6 members of one of the country's largest opposition parties were arrested, drawing strong criticism from civil society groups. On August 9th, thousands of Ivorians took to the streets of Abidjan to protest the arrests, carrying banners reading, "Enough is enough." Although President Alassane Ouattara's economic record is widely viewed as strong, his increasingly authoritarian actions have almost certainly galvanized opposition forces and strengthened their unity ahead of the vote. The risk of unrest has risen sharply following the call by Laurent Gbagbo and Tidjane Thiam for continued demonstrations, and will almost certainly escalate further if President Ouattara is perceived to have won the election unfairly. Ivory Coast has not experienced a fully peaceful or uncontested transfer of power since the death of President Félix Houphouët-Boigny in 1993, and past disputed elections have frequently led to violence. The 2010 presidential election, in which both Gbagbo and Ouattara claimed victory, ultimately triggered the Second Ivorian Civil War, resulting in the deaths of more than 3,000 people. The reconciliation process following the Second Ivorian Civil War remains incomplete, with the Commission for Dialogue, Truth and Reconciliation unable to implement many of its recommendations. The process has been undermined by accusations of bias, with claims that supporters of Laurent Gbagbo have been disproportionately prosecuted, while forces loyal to President Ouattara have faced little accountability. Deep mistrust continues to divide northern, pro-Ouattara communities from those in the south who back Gbagbo. While a return to full-scale civil war is currently unlikely, these unresolved political and social tensions greatly heighten the risk of widespread opposition-led protests. Such unrest could lead to violent confrontations with security forces and significant disruption to businesses, transport, and public services across the country. And in Cameroon, preparations for the upcoming presidential vote have triggered demonstrations and security crackdowns, raising fears of election-related violence. On the morning of October 14th, opposition leader Issa Chiroma Bakari unilaterally declared victory in the presidential race in a 5-minute address posted on social media, calling on incumbent President Paul Biya to concede. Bakari's announcement came despite the Constitutional Council, the country's official electoral authority, having yet to release any official results. So far, the government has issued no formal response. Following Bakari's declaration of victory, protests broke out in several cities on October 15th over alleged vote-counting irregularities. In Douala, Cameroon's economic capital, demonstrators clashed with security forces, who used water cannon to disperse the crowds. In Dishang, protesters set fire to the courthouse, the public prosecutor's office, and the headquarters of the ruling Cameroon People's Democratic Movement. Police responded with tear gas and made multiple arrests. Demonstrations also took place outside the courthouse in Kusuri and in Limbe, while in Bafang, supporters celebrated Bakari's claimed victory. Now our intelligence team's assessment. While the Constitutional Council has up to 2 weeks to officially declare the election results, Bakari's premature victory claim is highly likely to pressure the body to accelerate the process. The final results are expected to favor President Paul Biya, whose government has grown increasingly repressive in recent years. Since 2016, it has imposed harsh measures on Anglophone communities in the northwestern and southwestern regions, which make up roughly 15 to 20% of Cameroon's population. The conflict in these areas has resulted in at least 3,000 deaths and displaced nearly 700,000 people. Beyond the Anglophone crisis, the government has also intensified its crackdown on civil society, arresting and intimidating journalists and opposition figures, restricting public criticism of the regime, and routinely denying authorization for political gatherings. The 2018 presidential election in Cameroon triggered widespread protests led by opposition leader Maurice Kamto, to which the government responded with a heavy-handed crackdown and excessive use of force against demonstrators. Protests have continued intermittently since then. In September 2020, security forces again used tear gas and water cannon to disperse peaceful demonstrators. Cameroon's population continues to grapple with high unemployment and a rising cost of living, while the country's young majority remains largely politically disenfranchised. Many view the government as deeply corrupt under President Paul Biya, who has held power since 1982. Bakari's self-declared victory makes the emergence of competing narratives over the election result highly likely, with his camp expected to allege widespread electoral manipulation. Protests have already taken place, and if President Biya is officially declared the winner, Cameroon's disillusioned youth are likely to be quickly mobilized through social media, particularly in light of recent protest successes in countries such as Nepal, Madagascar, and Morocco. As in 2018, anti-government demonstrations will almost certainly be met with severe crackdowns. Security forces are highly likely to employ live ammunition, crowd control measures such as tear gas and water cannon, as well as internet shutdowns and mass arrests to suppress unrest. And in Madagascar, unrest has eased following a military coup and the impeachment of President Rajoelina, though risks of further instability remain. After weeks of protests that began on September 25th, the situation escalated sharply on the morning of October 12th, when multiple domestic and regional sources reported that a coup appeared to be underway. At 9:10 a.m. local time, the Presidency of the Republic of Madagascar issued a statement declaring that an attempt to seize power illegally and by force, contrary to the Constitution and to democratic principles, is currently underway. Shortly afterwards, the Army Corps of Personnel and Administrative and Technical Services, CAPSAT, an influential military unit that played a key role in the 2009 political crisis and in bringing Rajoelina to power, released a video announcing that the Madagascan armed forces were now being directed from their command center. This statement effectively placed operational control of the military under CAPSAT, with General Demosthenes Pikoulas reportedly appointed as head of the armed forces. That same day, President Andry Rajoelina was evacuated by a French military aircraft from Sainte-Marie Island after departing Madagascar by helicopter. On October 14th, President Rajoelina announced the dissolution of the National Assembly, ahead of anticipated impeachment proceedings against him. However, the Assembly's vice president declared the move legally invalid, and the proceedings went ahead as planned. Of the 163 members of Parliament, 131 participated in the vote, with 130 voting in favour of impeachment, effectively removing Rajoelina from office. Minutes after the impeachment vote, Colonel Michael Randrianirina of the Madagascan Army announced that the military had assumed control of the country. In his statement, Randrianirina declared that all state institutions, with the exception of the lower house of Parliament, would be dissolved. He was later named interim president. Following the announcement, Madagascar's High Court called for general elections to be held within 60 days. The office of the exiled and now deposed president, Andry Rajoelina, released a statement on October 14th condemning the decision of the High Constitutional Court and the transfer of power to Colonel Randrianirina as illegal and unconstitutional. The statement asserted that Rajoelina remains fully in office. Following Rajoelina's impeachment, protests across Madagascar have largely subsided and given way to celebrations. Representatives of the Gen Z Madagascar movement stated, "The change underway in Madagascar is not a coup d'état, but a popular awakening. No power has been seized by force. Citizens, associations, students, unions, and the military have acted out of conscience and patriotism." They added that, "This is not the time to seek personal interests, but to find urgent solutions to the problems." In response to the coup, the African Union announced the immediate suspension of Madagascar from the organization. Interim President Colonel Randrianirina has since declared that he is open to dialogue with the AU. Now for our assessment. The competing claims to legitimate authority by both Andry Rajoelina and Colonel Randrianirina are almost certainly a source of continued instability in Madagascar. Rajoelina, who is reportedly in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, is highly unlikely to be able to mount an effective challenge to his removal from power in the short term. While there is a realistic possibility that supporters of Andry Rajoelina will stage small-scale rallies, the broader wave of protests that began on September 25th is likely to subside following his impeachment and effective removal from power. However, in the medium to long term, the composition of the Transitional National Defense Council, or the absence of a credible and transparent roadmap toward democratic governance, could reignite political instability. This, in turn, would raise the risk of renewed large-scale unrest in the months ahead. The primary security risk in Madagascar at present is likely linked to the status of the gendarmerie, whose forces are almost certainly not fully aligned with the newly established military authorities. The gendarmerie has also been implicated in previous incidents involving excessive force and abuses against protesters. According to local media, one gendarmerie commander recently warned against the force's potential disbandment. In response, another senior officer issued a call for unity and affirmed that the gendarmerie would continue to obey orders, regardless of who holds power. The newly appointed commander of the gendarme forces, General Nonos Mbina Mamelison, has urged gendarmes to avoid being swayed by rumors or incitement. During the early stages of the coup on October 11th, the U.S. Embassy in Madagascar reported an exchange of gunfire between gendarmerie and military units in downtown Antananarivo, near Lake Anosi. An elevated risk of violence persists between rival factions within the security forces, particularly if CAPSAT fails to fully reassert command and consolidate control over the armed forces. Finally, in Asia-Pacific, Afghanistan and Pakistan have agreed to a brief ceasefire following deadly border clashes triggered by airstrikes in Kabul. Taliban and Pakistani forces clashed during the night of October 11th to 12th, after Taliban fighters launched attacks on several Pakistani military outposts along the border. The fighting followed a Pakistani airstrike in Kabul on October 9th, which was reportedly aimed at Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan (TTP) leader Noor Wali Mahsood. According to Taliban sources, 58 Pakistani soldiers were killed, and around 25 military posts were captured during the clashes. The Pakistani military, however, reported 23 of its soldiers killed and claimed to have inflicted heavy losses on Taliban forces, killing several hundred fighters. No fighting was reported on October 13th along the 2,611-kilometer border known as the Durand Line, which Afghanistan has never formally recognized. However, major border crossings remain closed, and trade between the two countries has been suspended. Pakistan's Interior Minister, Mohsin Naqvi, condemned the Taliban attacks as unprovoked, describing them as a serious breach of border security that could threaten regional stability. He stressed that Pakistan reserves the right to defend its territory and respond to any aggression, while also urging the Taliban to prevent militant groups from operating across the border. On October 15th, Afghanistan and Pakistan agreed to a 48-hour ceasefire beginning at 6 p.m. local time in Pakistan, just hours after a second wave of Pakistani airstrikes was reported in Kabul. Now our team's assessment: the Taliban offensive was almost certainly a retaliatory response to Pakistani airstrikes conducted on October 9th in Kabul and Paktika provinces. Pakistan has long accused the Taliban of sheltering terrorists within Afghanistan, particularly members of TTP, also known as the Pakistani Taliban, a coalition of extremist Islamist militant groups active mainly in Pakistan's tribal areas and along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Formed in 2007, the TTP's primary goal is to overthrow the Pakistani government and establish an Islamic emirate governed by its strict interpretation of Sharia law. The group frequently launches attacks inside Pakistan from Afghan territory and has in recent months intensified its operations in volatile border provinces such as Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan. The Pakistani Air Force routinely carries out airstrikes against TTP strongholds, leadership figures, and logistics networks in these border regions. However, strikes on Kabul are rare and would almost certainly have exceeded the Taliban's tolerance threshold, being seen not only as a major violation of Afghan sovereignty, but also as a direct challenge to the Taliban's authority and control. Despite the ceasefire, tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan remain high, and there is a realistic possibility of violations and renewed escalation along the border. Relations had likely already worsened following India's recent diplomatic overtures to the Taliban, including an 8-day visit to New Delhi by Afghan Foreign Minister Amir Khan Muttaqi. Islamabad has accused India of sponsoring militancy within Pakistan, further straining ties between the two neighbors. While some analysts have warned of the potential for all-out war between Pakistan and the Taliban, such a scenario is currently unlikely. Pakistan is grappling with significant domestic challenges, including economic instability, rising militancy, and ongoing political unrest, and would be reluctant to drive the Taliban closer to regional rivals such as India. Pakistan maintains clear air superiority over Afghanistan, possessing advanced combat aircraft and precision strike capabilities, while the Taliban's air defense infrastructure remains limited and largely ineffective. Islamabad will likely leverage this advantage to exert pressure on the Taliban. If the Taliban fails to curb cross-border militant activity into Pakistan, Islamabad is likely to escalate its air campaign against militant targets inside Afghanistan. This could include an increase in strikes on Kabul and other major population centers, as well as operations across the border provinces. In response, the Taliban may intensify counterintelligence measures, including tighter media restrictions, enhanced internal security, and further border closures. They may also impose internet and telecommunications shutdowns to hinder electronic surveillance of Taliban and militant leadership, or to disrupt the interception of communications between the Taliban and affiliated militant groups. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.